Hello everyone, we are group 6 and we'll be reporting about chapter 11, the medical evidence, as well as chapter 12, the evidence of the missing body. Now of course we'll start with chapter 11 first, the medical evidence. Now we all know how important medical evidences are when it comes to knowing how a person died, what was the cause, what were the causes. Was it natural, was it unnatural? Natural causes being sicknesses or old age, and unnatural causes like murder or suicide. Now, such was the case with John Wayne Gacy. So this person, John Wayne Gacy, was an infamous American serial killer responsible for the death of 33 people. Medical evidences help in convicting this criminal and finally killing him because he was sentenced to death, and through the help of forensic pathologist Dr. Robert J. Stein as well as his team, they were able to find out that he was guilty of the crimes that he was accused of. Now we all know that Jesus died on the cross. He was crucified, but there are several people and several theories that claim that he didn't actually die. There were claims like the swoon theory, the wrong tomb theory, theft theory, and visionary and legendary development theory. They were all discussed in lesson 5, but in this chapter we'll focus on the swoon theory, as this theory keeps recurring in different literatures like the Passover plot, the Jesus scroll, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and Jesus and the riddle of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, all of which have variations from each other, varying degrees of exaggeration, but the authors themselves confess that they cannot prove their claim. Now, there's also the Islam's scripture, the Quran. Even the Quran suggests that Jesus never really died on the cross, and it also claims that someone or another person may have been made to look like Jesus, as someone said in the previous report. So this book, Quran, supports the swoon theory. As well as the Ahmadiyya Muslims in India, they claim that Jesus fled to India where he died. They even have a shrine in Srinagar, Kashmir, where they think Jesus is actually buried. There are also theologians like Karl Barth and Carl Venturini, as well as others, who believe in the swoon theory as well. Now, there are two reasons or reasonings that the swoon theory suggests: that either Jesus fainted due to exhaustion or he fainted because of intoxication. Now, these theologians, the two Carls, they believe in the former, that Jesus fainted due to exhaustion because he experienced so much while he was being crucified, even before he was being crucified. So they think that he fainted due to exhaustion and he didn't really die on the cross. Now, there are also conspiracy theorists who believe in the swoon theory, and they believe in the latter reasoning of this theory, that Jesus fainted due to being intoxicated or being drugged. They even cited Mark chapter 15 verses 36 and 44 to support their claim, where Jesus was, based on their interpretation, apparently drugged so he would faint. These people, these same people, these conspiracy theorists, believe that Jesus was also only resuscitated rather than resurrected. Now let's differentiate between resuscitation and resurrection. So resuscitation is mainly used on the scientific field. It means it is the process of reviving someone from unconsciousness or apparent death. So this means that resuscitation is temporary and the person will die again when that time comes. Now, resurrection, this is often used with spiritual or theological implications. This means that being resurrected is permanent and eternal. The person will be granted eternal life. So this is what actually happened with Jesus, but these people, these theorists, these theologians, they believe in being rational rather than the supernatural. They believe in what is only applicable on earth. Now, as we go on with the report, we'll be able to tell what had actually happened when Jesus was crucified, not just backed by the Bible and Christian evidences, but also by medical and scientific evidences and explanations from various professionals like Alexander Matherell, who is the interviewee in this chapter, as well as William Lane Craig, who is the interviewee for chapter 12. And as we go on with the discussion, we'll be able to answer this question. Was Jesus' death a sham and his resurrection a hoax? So I hope you listen to my groupmates as they discuss further. Thank you.
So next is the torture before the cross. So the events leading to Jesus' death were marked by intense physical and psychological suffering, starting after the Last Supper when Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. There, he experienced significant stress knowing the suffering ahead, leading to the rare condition hematidrosis, where blood mixed with sweat. And the conclusion is that the physical suffering of Jesus was immense and documented medically, and the gospel accounts of his death are consistent with modern medical understanding, and John's description of blood and water enhances the credibility of the testimony. So in the agony of the cross, the crucifixion was a brutal and slow form of execution, unlike modern methods where death is quick and certain. And in crucifixion, the process of death was not always predictable, and determining whether someone had died was more difficult. And however, historical and archaeological evidence suggests that Jesus' death was not an accident. So the conclusion of this is that Roman executioners were highly skilled at confirming death, and archaeological evidence support the gospel accounts of Jesus' crucifixion. And death by crucifixion was a slow and certain process for the victim. So lastly is the cause of death. The cause of death during crucifixion is primarily asphyxiation. When a person is crucified in a vertical position, the body's muscles and diaphragm are under immense strain, causing the chest to remain in an inhaled state. In order to exhale, the individual must push up on the feet, which is agonizing due to the nails driven through them. And this cycle of pushing up to exhale, followed by relaxation and inhalation, continues until the victim is physically unable to push up any longer. And the conclusion of this is that the process is physically exhaustive and guarantees eventual death.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my topic is all about the skeptical perspective on the medical evidence presented in the case for Christ. So Lee Strobel also represents the post-resurrection appearance of Jesus. As evidence for his resurrection, he interviews Dr. Gray Habermas, a religious studies expert, who argues that there is a strong evidence for a multiple eyewitness accounts of Jesus appearing to his disciples and others after his death. Skeptics, however, question the reliability of these accounts, arguing that they are based on faith and not on verifiable evidence. They point out that the accounts of the post-resurrection appearance are found only in the Gospels, which are considered by many to be unreliable historical sources. Furthermore, skeptics argue that these accounts may have been embellished over time, or may have been influenced by the desire of early Christians to spread their beliefs. The importance of the context and interpretation. So, the skeptical perspective on the medical evidence in Christ is presented in the case therefore highlights the importance. The interpretation and evaluating historical claims, skeptics argue that the evidence presented in a book is often selected and biased towards a Christian worldview. They emphasizes that they need for a critical analysis or analyze the source considering alternative explanations and potential biases. In conclusion, we have the Christ, but while the case for Christ represents a compelling argument for the historicity of Jesus and the Christian faith, the medical evidence presented has been subject to skepticism. Skeptics argue that the evidence is not conclusive and alternative explanations for the evidence described in the Gospel are possible. The debate surrounding the medical evidence and the case for Christ highlights the importance of critical thinking, contextual analysis, and willingness to consider multiple perspectives when evaluating historical claims. Ultimately, the interpretation of evidence remains a matter of personal belief and individual judgment. And that's all. Thank you.
Craig, a renowned scholar in science, philosophy, and theology, is best known for his work on the resurrection of Jesus. He has authored influential works like Reasonable Faith and the Existence of God and the Beginning of the Universe. Was Jesus really buried in a tomb? Some argues Jesus' body was left unburied, but Craig represents evidence for a tomb burial. First is the early creed. A creed from shortly after Jesus' death affirms his burial and resurrection. Second is the Gospel accounts. All four Gospels consistently identify Joseph and Arimathea who buried Jesus. Third is Mark's Passion. Mark's Gospel, based on an earlier source, includes the burial account. In the conclusion, early creed's Gospel consistency and historical evidence strongly support Jesus' tomb burial.
Is Joseph of Arimathea historical? So first, we will know who is Joseph of Arimathea. So Joseph of Arimathea was actually a part of the council or the Sanhedrin, the group of Jewish religious leaders who called for Jesus' crucifixion. So Joseph of Arimathea is a wealthy and prominent member of the Sanhedrin, and he owned the tomb where Jesus' body was placed. So what the Gospel books say about him? The book of Mark mentioned that all members of the Sanhedrin voted to kill Jesus. But in the account of Luke, mentioned that Joseph of Arimathea was not present during the official vote was taken. So is Joseph of Arimathea historical? So there are people or skeptics says that Joseph of Arimathea was invented, or the story was invented. But it would have been unlikely for the early Christians to invent a positive role for a Sanhedrin member, as the group was generally viewed negatively by this Jewish or by the Jews. So if the story were fabricated, it is unlikely that the early Christians would have chosen someone from the Jewish leadership to be the hero who buried Jesus. So this would have been counterproductive to the narrative suggesting the authenticity. So the body of Jesus was placed indeed in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. So according to John 80, the honorable burial of Jesus is one of the earliest and the best attested facts that we have about the historical of Jesus. So the resurrection of Jesus was only spiritual in nature. So in the time of the Jews, they believed the physical concept of resurrection. So it's not spiritual in nature, because they believe that when a person is resurrected, so it was likely the body is, or the physical body is resurrected. So this proves that the empty tomb was left behind. So, in the argument of Strobel and Craig, the evidence strongly supports that the historical existence of Joseph of Arimathea in his role in Jesus' burial. How secure was the tomb? So, the description of the tomb. Jesus' tombs as a rock-cut tomb, typical for wealthier individuals in the first century of Jewish society, since the owner of the tomb is Joseph of Arimathea, which is rich and also part of the Sanhedrin. So the tombs often had small entrance and an inner chamber where bodies were laid on stone shelves or benches. So a large stone, likely circular and rolled into a groove, was used to seal the tomb, and smaller stone to secure the disc. So this is a picture, but this is not the original tomb of Jesus, but only a picture lang, so that we can imagine what is the tomb that was used in this time. So the tomb's location. Joseph of Arimathea's involvement ensured that Jesus' burial site was not mystery to either his followers or his opponent. So how protected Jesus' tomb? So in Matthew's Gospel, specifically in Matthew 27 verse 62 to 66, it describes that how Jewish authorities, fearing that the disciple might steal the body of Jesus. So the Jewish authorities requested a Roman guards to secure the tomb. So in that time, so Roman guards were highly disciplined and trained soldiers. So if they fail in their duties, they faced severe punishment, even death, making it unlikely that they would abandon their post. Because there are some people says that the tomb of Jesus was not guarded. So that's why, diba, there are theories daw that the body of Jesus wasn't there on the tomb since it was stolen, the body was stolen. But in this time, the history says that the tomb was really guarded by the Roman guard. So the tomb was also sealed, likely with a cord stretched across the stone and fastened with a clay or wax marked with the Roman imperial seal. So if anyone will break that seal, would have been in a serious crime and punishable by the Roman law. So kahit sino, wala talagang would dare to open the tomb or would steal the body of Jesus. So in the argument, Strobel and Craig argue that stealing the body would have been unlikely, unreasonable. The disciples were hiding and terrified after the crucifixion of Jesus, and they lacked resources or courage to overpower the Roman guards, to break the seal, and to remove the body undetected. So, Craig's detailed account of the tomb highlights a plausibility and aligns with the archaeological and historical evidence from the time. So, the description supports his argument that an empty tomb is historically reliable component of the resurrection narrative. The known location, secure sealing, and the involvement of Joseph of Arimathea make alternative explanations, such as theft or mistaken tomb, is highly improbable.
So now, let's talk about the resurrection of Jesus and how is it understood and interpreted very differently by Christians and Jews. Here's a breakdown of what happened according to each perspective. Christians believe that the resurrection of Jesus is a historical and spiritual event that forms the foundation of their faith. While for many Jewish people, the resurrection of Jesus is not accepted as a historical or theological event. To understand it better, let's go to the first topic. Were any guards present? So, the resurrection of Jesus claims that counterclaims in the first century. This is all about a debate between early Jews and Christians. So, the overview is the resurrection of Jesus was central to early Christians preaching. It became a major point of contention with Jewish authorities. So, the Christian claims Jesus rose from the dead. The evidence presented by Christians is the empty tomb. Women found the tomb empty. It can be found in Mark 16 verse 1 to 8. Next is eyewitness testimonies, appearances to disciples and others. It can be found in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 3 to 8. Fulfilled prophecies, references to Old Testament scriptures. For example, the Isaiah 53. So, the Jewish counterclaim that the body was stolen, claim in Matthew 28 verse 12 to 15. Disciples stole the body while guards were asleep. Challenges to this claim is guards unlikely to sleep due to Roman discipline. Heavy stone and Roman seal cannot easily bypassed. What about the contradiction? Jewish and Christians' perspective in the first century. So now let's read the phrases found in the book. In Matthew, with Mary Magdalene and other Mary arrived toward dawn at the tomb. There is a rock in front of it. There is a violent earthquake, and an angel descends and rolls back the stone. In Mark, the woman arrived at the tomb at sunrise, and the stone has been rolled back. In Luke, when the woman arrived at early dawn, they find the stone had already been rolled back. In Matthew, an angel is sitting on the rock outside the tomb. So, to sum everything up, the resurrection fulfilled Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah and Isaiah 53. Jesus' rising proved his divinity. On the other hand, the Jewish counterclaim the Messiah was expected to bring political liberation and not die and rise again. No clear Old Testament prophecies explicitly describe resurrection. Discrepancies be harmonized. The Gospel writers had different audiences and theological goals. So in Matthew, it emphasizes Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. In Mark, focuses on action and immediacy. In Luke, highlights historical investigation and inclusion of Gentiles. In John, presents a spiritual and theological perspectives. In summary, for Christians, the resurrection is central to their faith and marks a new covenant with God. And for Jews, the claims about Jesus challenge traditional Jewish teachings and expectations of the Messiah. Despite these differing views, the resurrection remains a key topic of theological dialogue and the debate between Jews and Christians.
Can the witnesses be trusted? The Gospels agree that the empty tomb was discovered by women who were friends and followers of Jesus. Martin considers their testimony suspect because they were not objective observers when asked if this relationship undermines the reliability of their testimony. Craig argues the opposite. He explains that in the first century Jewish society, women were considered low in status and their testimony were deemed worthless to the extent that they couldn't serve as legal witnesses. Therefore, if the stories were fabricated, it would have featured male disciples as the discoverers. The fact that women are reported as the first witnesses to the empty tomb indicates that the gospel writers recorded an actual event, despite it being potentially embarrassing, which supports the historicity of the account rather than it being a legend. So yes, the witnesses can be trusted because sa first century Jewish society, ang mga women, they are deemed worthless, and ilahang mga opinion wala kayo nagamatter, to the point nga even as legal witnesses dili sila maka-conserve. So the fact nga babae ang gi-record and dili lalaki proves nga dili siya fabricated, kay sa ato nga century dili nila i-record ang mga any babae nga mga accomplishments or mga basta na mga major parts nga mga babae dili na ikuan. Ilang permi pang butang is lalaki. Why did the woman visit the tomb? Craig responded to the question of why the woman would go to anoint Jesus' body if they knew the tomb was sealed, by emphasizing the depth of their love and devotion. He argued that scholars who haven't experienced such emotions shouldn't judge their actions. Craig explained that grieving people often act out of hope and love rather than logic. He suggested that the woman might have hoped someone would have moved the stone. Visiting tombs to anoint bodies was a Jewish practice, and questioning the practicality of their actions overlooks the personal and emotional context. So, the reason why ning visit ang women sa tomb, aside from they were followers and friends ni Jesus, gusto nila i-anoint ang lawas ni Jesus, since that was a Jewish practice. And even though they knew nga the tomb was sealed, people often decide mo take action sila without any logical explanation. They act depending on their silang emotions. Like ingon diri, people often act out of love and hope and love. So muna siyang why they visited the tomb even though nga sealed. Why didn't Christians cite the tomb? While preparing for his interview with Craig, the author reviewed atheist arguments against the resurrection. One atheist critic argued that early Christian preachers never pointed to the empty tomb as evidence, citing Peter's sermon in Acts 2 as an example. The critic concluded that if the disciples didn't emphasize the empty tomb, neither should we. When the author presented this to Craig, he refuted it by showing that Peter's sermon in Acts 2 implicitly references the empty tomb. Peter contrasts David's tomb, which remained with Jesus' resurrection, stating that Jesus' body did not decay and that they were witnesses to his resurrection. Craig also pointed to Acts 13:29 to 31, where Paul mentions Jesus being laid in a tomb and then raised from the dead, implying the empty tomb. Craig concluded that early preachers clearly conveyed the message of the empty tomb, even if they didn't use those exact words. So naay atheist and critic nga ni-argue siya nga ang mga Christian preachers wala sila ning point out sa empty tomb as evidence nga buhi gyud si Jesus nga ning rise siya from the dead. Dayon si Craig ni-refute siya nga ang Acts 2 it reference to siya sa empty tomb, kay si Jesus ning ang lawas ni Jesus wala ning decay, and that they were witnesses to his resurrection. So ang kato siya ga-imply siya nga the tomb was empty, cause ang lawas ni Jesus wala ning decay and ning kuan siya, ning rise. So even though nga dili siya the exact same words ang pag-ingon sa mga kuan sa mga Christians, it's still the same ang point nga the tomb was empty and ning bangon si Jesus.
So, what's the affirmative evidence? So, Craig presents 6 main arguments. Namely, number 1, early Christian tradition. So, Paul's writings in 1 Corinthians 15 imply an early belief in the resurrection and an empty tomb. Second, public knowledge. The tomb's location was known to both Christian and Jews, making it unlikely that the resurrection claims could have emerged if the tomb were not empty. Next, source of Mark's Gospel. The language and style of Mark's Gospel indicate it drew from an earlier source, likely written before AD 37, making legend development improbable. Next, simplicity of Mark's account. Mark's straightforward narrative lacks embellishments typical of later legends, suggesting it reflects a historical event. Next, women as witnesses. The fact that women discovered the empty tomb adds credibility, as it would be unlikely for the disciples to fabricate these details. And last one, the sixth one, which is the Jewish polemic. So early Jewish arguments acknowledge the tomb's emptiness, focusing instead on explaining the disappearance of Jesus' body. So this argument supports the historicity of the empty tomb and highlight its significance within the Christian narrative of the resurrection. So what about alternative theories? The interviewer presents several alternative theories to explain the empty tomb, including the wrong tomb theory, the later legend theory, and other theories. So Craig counters each theory, arguing that the tomb was well known, making the wrong tomb scenario unlikely. Second, early accounts of the empty tomb predate any legend development. Third, the disciples had no motive to steal the body and risk their lives for a lie. The authorities would have had no reason to remove the body. Next, Jesus' brutal crucifixion makes the swoon theory impossible, which is right. And the last one is the existence of multiple independent accounts of Jesus' appearances dismisses the hallucination theory. So Craig posits the best explanation for the empty tomb is that God raised Jesus from the dead. He argues that belief in this miracle doesn't contradict science and hinges on the philosophical question of God's existence. So the dialogue underscores the complexity of historical interpretation and the interplay between faith and evidence regarding the resurrection. So the conclusion is the tomb was vacant. So this passage summarizes a discussion about whether Jesus' tomb was really empty after his death. So Craig presented strong arguments for the tomb being empty, even though this is a miraculous event. So critics have tried to explain the empty tomb without accepting a miracle, but their explanations don't work very well. A famous legal expert agreed that the empty tomb is a very difficult factor for those who don't believe in miracles to explain. And that's all for our report this morning.